Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndall Curtis. Tonight we'll be focusing on international issues, and tomorrow it's likely that the processing of asylum seekers will again become one of those, as Labor's opposition to offshore processing as ending Labor's opposition to offshore processing will be complete. At the end of this week, Julian Assange is likely to hear whether his asylum claim from Ecuador is likely to be agreed to, and also a debate that hasn't made its way onto the political stage, but is going on amongst experts on whether the US should cede some ground towards China and whether Australia should help that process. We'll cover that off as well. Joining me to discuss these issues are Labor Senator Doug Cameron and Green Senator Lee Rhiannon. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
We'll start first with the passage of the government's asylum seeker legislation through the House of Representatives.
When John Howard, as Prime Minister, went to Kim Beazley and asked for that support, it was provided at his great political cost. At his great political cost, because he saw the best interests of the nation. Now, these are things which have been debated many times in this place. And what's important now is that we move forward. And that's why, in order to get to this point, that the House and hopefully the other place in good time, in expeditious time, can pass this legislation, find a way forward.
This day has been a long time coming. The debate is continuing in the Parliament for good reason, and that is because this government, this Prime Minister, must face the music for their failures over the last 4 years. The Prime Minister can't just airbrush away the consequences of her policy failures over the last 4 years.
Doug Cameron, you were elected in 2007, the election at which Labor took to the people a policy of ending offshore processing. 4 years later, now Labor's now implementing offshore processing again. Do you have a heavy heart about that change?
Very heavy heart, very concerned that the tone of politics, the polemics and political debate in this country have not allowed itself to actually think about the humanity that's involved in the refugees. And I think there's been much vilification of refugees by specifically the coalition. And I don't think that's been good for politics in this country.
What's your view of the fact that there is not yet a time limit for the time people who've been granted refugee status might spend on places like Nauru or Manus Island?
Well, you see, what has been said is that this whole report has to be engaged as a one. And what we've got at the moment is we've got an agreement in principle in terms of increasing the refugee numbers. So if you increase the refugee numbers, then that will mean less of a stay on Manus Island and Nauru. So there has to be a regional approach. There has to be an increase in the number of refugees. We should not have it as an agreement in principle. Labour should say we are going to do these things, and that means less stay on Manus Island and Nauru. I don't like Manus Island, I don't like Nauru, but we're here because we couldn't get an agreement to an approach that the UNHCR said was okay, and that was Malaysia, and the Greens have got a lot to answer for that.
Lee, quite a lot of what the expert panel has recommended, the Greens would support an increase in the humanitarian intake, not just to 20,000, but to 27,000, a broader push for a regional approach to this. Can you in the end support those things but ignore the expert panel's recommendation for the package to be taken as a whole?
Well, the package as a whole is effectively Howard's Pacific solution. And Doug talks about the problem of the polemics, but the problem is how the Labor Party's handled it. We could have worked together. Labor and the Greens could have come forward with a solution. And I still remain surprised and disappointed that Doug pushes a Malaysian solution. That is a country that's outside the Refugee Convention. It would not have acted as a deterrence. Deterrence is just part of the language and the rhetoric here. But for people from Sri Lanka and from Afghanistan and other countries desperate to come here, they're thinking about how they escape their situation, not what the laws are in Australia. That's what should have been addressed.
But in the end, isn't the principle of no advantage that is leading to the current lack of a time limit for those who are processed on Nauru and Manus Island, isn't that one way of ensuring that people don't make that often dangerous boat journey, and if you, in concert with that, speed up the processing times in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, doesn't that help with a solution?
No, not at all. This idea of no advantage that has been talked about, I mean, that is not how the system works. And again, we have the problem today, and this legislation is being rushed into the Senate tonight. And what we're seeing is that the government is ready with tents and has many refugees ready to move onto Nauru, and this is a terrible situation. It is, Doug. It's a terrible situation. No, we're not to blame at all. I mean, once upon a time, Doug, you used to speak out on these issues. Now, your constituents from Labor for Refugees, the various asylum resource centres and the refugee groups have come out very critical of Labor's latest plan. They were critical of you in June. They are critical of you now.
I'm just sick and tired of the political purity from the Greens, the confected anger, the fake tears from the Greens on these issues. If you were fair dinkum about this, you would actually think about people being killed on the high seas, and you would come to some reasonable approach, and you have not moved.
That's what the policy you took to the 2007 election and that was implemented afterwards was actually much closer to the Greens policy or onshore processing.
Sure, but at that stage there wasn't a network of people smugglers putting people on boats and having them killed coming over here. And I think from time to time you've got to examine your conscience. You've got to say political purity has to go out the window. Fake anger and fake tears are not good enough on this. You have to deal with the political hard realities. And that's what I've done. And I think it's important that we have a regional approach, that Labour actually increases the numbers, that we make sure people are not on Manus Island in some prison type approach, that there's a bit of humanity in the treatment. These are the issues that I have to deal with now within the Labour Party. I want to deal with the practical issues that we face, not some theoretical thing that if you're not signatory to an international convention you should be ignored, because there's no one signatory in this region sufficient to help in this regional approach.
Lee, if the government can get the stronger protections in the Malaysia agreement that the expert panel talked about, would you be happy having that agreement as a template for a regional approach to offshore processing?
Well, we clearly need the regional assessment. We need much more money going to the UNHCR. But the Malaysian solution, I mean, the court found that was illegal. I mean, that's what the Greens were not going to do, that deal with Labor and break the law and break the responsibilities under the convention. And what Doug and Labor are signing off on is a plan where it's indefinite detention. A couple of hundred refugees are about to be sent over to Nauru for indefinite detention. They can't tell us how many.
Your own actions on that. Well, because if you'd have actually done what the UNHCR said about Malaysia, they said it should be implemented, and there was important protections there. There was safeguards on non-refoulement. There was the right to asylum, the principle of family unity, the best interests of the child, humane reception conditions, including protection against arbitrary detention, and they would get lawful status. But the Greens just wiped that away because of the purity.
But then we'll have to move on.
Well, Doug, you just keep changing the goalposts, because when we had the big debate in June, at that time you said we should not go back to the Pacific solution. But that's now what your party has done. We've got Howard's Pacific solution.
Stop people getting killed.
Yes, but that's what you're about to vote for.
We might move on now to another asylum question, that of Julian Assange's seeking asylum in Ecuador. Doug, has the government done everything to deal with Julian Assange that it would do in any other case of an Australian overseas facing trouble?
I'm advised they have. I'm advised that the government has provided every assistance to Julian Assange. I have been a long-time supporter of Julian Assange. I think the situation he finds himself in, where he could be taken to the US and face the death sentence or life imprisonment, is a real problem. Actually, the US attaché visited me yesterday, which was quite a coincidence. I put it to them that I would not be happy with any attempt to get Julian Assange into America to face these charges. That would not be a good thing for relations between Australia and the US.
Lee, do you think if Julian Assange does end up gaining asylum in Ecuador, that's the best outcome for him, or would there be something preferable?
Well, that's the negotiations that are going on at the present time, and I think his legal team and he and his family have made that judgment. But I am surprised that Doug says that he accepts, from what I understand, that the government have been assisting diplomatically Mr Assange, because Julian Burnside has been there, other leading lawyers, and they're deeply concerned at the lack of support that the Australian government have provided. Thank heavens for that. Let's say thank heavens for Ecuador.
If we could now move on to our third topic, we've probably got the least time for the biggest topic, but that's the debate underway amongst academics and experts about whether the US should cede some power effectively towards China, recalibrate its position, and whether Australia should be part of that. Doug, this is a very big debate, but do you think this government's attitude towards both China and the United States and the balance between the two is being calibrated correctly?
Well, I think so, but I've expressed some concerns about the increased militarisation in the region. I'm concerned about that, I always have been. I don't agree with Tony Abbott's view that we are family with the United States. We are two independent countries, sovereign countries, and we've got to run our country the way we want to run it in our best interests. So I've got some concerns about the coalition's approach to this, and I don't want increased militarisation.
Lee, what do you think are the key questions when Australia looks at how it balances that relationship between two superpowers who will have a significant influence on this region?
Well, the key thing is that Australia needs to have an independent foreign policy, but it has economic interests with both of those countries, and it has that strategic interest, particularly with the US. Yes, and that's where I think it does need to be more independent. Having US troops based here, an increase in US military operations, particularly in Western Australia and in the Northern Territory. But also, and what a lot of people are not aware of, there is an increase in US military operation in the Southeast Asia. The US are negotiating having more warships for US warships in the Philippines, having a presence in Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia. That sends a very bad signal to China. I mean, for the first time, US has a rival in China, not just politically and in terms of power, but also economically. With the old Soviet Union, they didn't have that economic rivalry that they have now. The US has to shift, Australia has to shift, and a start would be ending that military build-up.
And China also have to play a smart political role. It's not just the US and Australia.
Yes, no, I agree.
China are part of this as well, and they have to actually be a bit smart in their geopolitical game.
Yeah, no, Doug's great, and it's good to be in agreement with Doug yet again.
And that's where we'll end it. Having reached agreement, Doug Cameron and Lee Rhiannon, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill. Please be with us at the same time tomorrow. Good night.